I think one of the most exciting and interesting things for me on this interview journey was getting to meet and interview one-on-one 5 U.S. American presidents. You think about it, the most important person in the world is the President of the United States. People refer to the Truman era, the Roosevelt era, the Kennedy years. It's not the Dean Rusk years. It's not the George Marshall years. I got very lucky with the first president I met, Gerald R. Ford. As previously mentioned in another segment, I grew very close to the director Frank Capra, who was living in La Quinta. Coincidentally, Congressman Gerry Ford would winter in Rancho Mirage, which is right next to La Quinta, because the winters in Michigan were horrendously cold. And Capra and Ford were very, very close friends. As he told me one time, if I had to list the top 5 friendships I've had in my life, Walter Lance is way up there, William Wyler, and surprisingly, Gerald Ford. One day, my wife and I were in Palm Springs. We're probably talking 1972, and Mr. Capra called, inquiring whether I could help make up a foursome at the La Quinta Country Club. They were one man short. They were about to tee off in 10 minutes, and that person evidently had gotten the flu. I was 5 minutes away, and I said, Mr. Capra, I'll be right over. When he introduced me to the foursome, it was Capra, a Palm Springs banker, and Congressman Gerald Ford. Now, Gerald Ford was virtually unknown in California. How many Michigan congressmen would the average Californian know? Probably doesn't know his own congressman in many districts. So this is how I met Ford, and it was really Al and Jerry. And we got along very well. He's one of the most personable people you can meet. Absolutely no air about him, no ego. It's like talking to your next door neighbor. Total equality there. Now, he was the minority leader in the House, but the Republicans were not in power. I don't think 1 in 10,000 Californians would know him. I know when we went to a restaurant and I was eating with him, absolutely nobody recognized him. This was a restaurant with 200 people. And I'll never forget, a year later, we are now into the Watergate era. Spiro Agnew is removed from office for literally taking bags of money from contractors, and my friend and congressman, Gerald Ford, is made vice president. Nixon selects him, the Congress confirms him. At this point, I still had access to him. There's a tremendous difference between the presidency and the vice presidency.
Did you feel any pressure to treat him differently when he became the vice president of the United States?
I did, but he wouldn't accept it. He wouldn't let it happen. I called him Mr. Vice President, but there was no sense of elevation. Now, there's a tremendous elevation between a congressman and the second most important man in the country in terms of access to the presidency. If President Nixon had a heart attack or stroke, my friend Gerald Ford would have been president. And I asked him one day, we're now into 1973, the Watergate hearings are starting. John Dean accuses Nixon of conspiring and involved in payoffs and hush money, and it's a frightening time. And I asked my friend, Vice President Ford, what the chances were of him becoming president. And he looked at me and he said, Al, slim and none. And I said, Mr. Vice President, how could that be? Haldeman is gone, Ehrlichman is gone, John Dean is gone, everybody's leaving. He said, Al, let me explain why I say that. Richard Nixon and I had a one-on-one meeting about 2 weeks ago. And I said, Mr. President, I have 2 questions and I'll be out of here. Number 1, did you have any knowledge of the Watergate break-in? He said, Jerry, absolutely none. Okay? Number 2, did you in any way, after the break-in, conspire to hide any of this, obstruct justice, try and prevent certain things from happening? He says, Jerry, hand on the Bible, I'm pretty much quoting Nixon, I was not involved in any of that. Now he said, I had known Nixon since 1946. We're now at 1973. That's almost 30 years. I consider him a very close friend. Pat and he, Betty and I, would double date in our early days in Washington. I thought he was a man of integrity, so I believed him.
Did Ford think that Nixon was suited to be a president?
Yes, he thought Nixon was extremely astute on foreign affairs, maybe the best person ever qualified to be a president. He had served in the House, he had served in the Senate, he was vice president, absolutely qualified to be president. And he said, Nixon disappointed me more than anybody else in my political life. He told me he had no involvement in the burglary, no involvement in the cover-up, and gave me complete permission to go on television shows, Meet the Press, the Today Show, and tell that to the American public. Now that's putting my reputation on the line. That's my integrity. And I did it on dozens of shows. Well, of course, it was a lie. He was deeply involved in the cover-up. Not the break-in, I don't think he knew. That was too far down the line. So that is my biggest disappointment in my political life. Nixon lying to me, eyeball to eyeball, in the Oval Office, and letting me make a fool of myself when I went out to the public. So, as a little side note, my wife and I attended Nixon's 25th swearing-in anniversary at the Nixon Library. This would be about 1998. Big party, I was invited, and I wanted to see, I'd never seen Nixon and Ford together, and I wanted to see if Ford still held kind of a grudge for embarrassing him. Being I knew the inside story, Ford telling me what happened, I remember there was a time when Nixon, Ford, Hilda, and I were together, just for a minute or so, me introducing her to them. And I looked directly at Ford, and I could see the disdain on his face that he had to be there. After all, he was Nixon's vice president, a member of the cabinet, and you could see the body language. Now, I knew that because I knew the story. If I showed you the picture, you wouldn't pick it up. But I believe Ford never forgave Nixon for doing what he did to him, and therefore Ford would not introduce me to Nixon. I had to get to Nixon on my own.
And how did you get to Nixon?
All right, let's talk about Richard Nixon. Nobody that I knew would introduce me to Richard Nixon. Ford would not. As a matter of fact, when I even brought it up, he inferred to me, you know, why. He said, "Al, remember that story back in '73? I said, "I sure do." So he would not help me. He could have picked up the phone and made it very easy. I read through Nixon's autobiography. Now we're probably in the late 70s. And Nixon loved 3 things: baseball, Pat Nixon, and politics. Not necessarily in that order. I'm assuming it's Pat Nixon first. So I'm reading through this book, and there's baseball all over the place. So I said to myself, I'm going to try and get to him, but first I want to become very knowledgeable about baseball. Nixon was not a fan of baseball, he was an expert on baseball. It was remarkable, his knowledge. So I called someone who I felt knew more than Nixon, and that was my friend Leo DeRocha, living in Palm Springs, and suffered a stroke, but I had full access to him. And I said, Leo, if you were with Nixon and you had 5 or 6 minutes to discuss baseball, what would you ask him? So he thought a little, and he said, Al, I'd ask him a couple of questions. First of all, Nixon looks at baseball before integration and after integration. That's the only way he sees it fair. For example, Josh Gibson, he thought was a better hitter than Babe Ruth, but they didn't play in the same league. So that's the first thing I'd ask him. And so Leo schooled me in these very esoteric baseball questions, because you can't ask Nixon, like, who's the best hitter? Is Yogi Berra a better catcher than Roy Campanella? That's too simplistic. So Leo gave me a list of 10 questions, and then I started following the newspapers, and in probably 1979, Nixon was going to San Clemente for the dedication of his library. It was not open to the public. It was just open to the City Council of San Clemente and newspaper reporters. I was doing the taxes for the chief photographer at the Daily Pilot. And I said to him, are you covering the Nixon event in San Clemente? Oh, absolutely, it's a big event out. Any way you might get me in? I had done him a lot of favors, saved him a lot of money on his taxes, and he said, yeah, how good are you with a camera? And I said, not very good. I'll tell you what I'll do. I have one assistant that I can bring to this event, and he could care less about politics. He's into surfing and swimming and, you know, that kind of thing. He couldn't. I will give you his press badge, and you'll come as my assistant. Bring a camera, and I'll add another one, so you have cameras draped over your shoulders, and I'll have a press pass. This is before 9/11, and so things were very loose. So I get into this situation. There's not that many people there. It's not open to the public. I would say 50 people total, of which half were newspaper reporters. And once the event was over, there was a big model of the Nixon library, which never went there. It went to Whittier, but this was the first proposal. And as we're walking to the limousine to take the members of the city council to City Hall to give Nixon some proclamation, I immediately took my press pass off. So now people would think I'm a friend of Nixon. After all, you were either a friend of Nixon, a city official, or press. So I took the press thing off. But people just assumed that, you know, that I was somebody official with the city of San Clemente. Who knows what I was. And we're walking there, and I got up even with Nixon, and I said, Mr. President, is it true you look at baseball pre-integration and post-integration? Big smile on his face. How'd you know that? Oh, I said, I've heard that's the way you look at it. Yeah, that's very true. We have a little while to go to get to the car. So I'm peppering him with other questions. Questions like, do you feel the knuckleball should be allowed versus the spitball? All kinds of questions that DeRocha had given me, which were pretty impressive because look who they were coming from. And he's chattering away. And I said to him, if you had to pick an all-star team, how do you handle the dilemma of the pre-integration and the post-integration? Well, that's a very good question. I would probably substitute Josh Gibson for Babe Ruth, and I would go one guy for Lou Gehrig, and so we're talking for at least 5 minutes. That's how long the walk is to the limousine.
And he didn't find this unusual, a young man coming out of nowhere asking him about baseball?
I think he was so into baseball, loved it so much. The questions were good because they came from DeRocha, that it was his favorite subject next to Pat and politics, and he was just going. So we all got into the car. The limousine was huge. These other city councilmen didn't know who I was. They didn't want to ask me in front of the ex-president. It would look embarrassing. So we end up going to City Hall, and I'm still following him. I have an interesting picture, which we can show of all of us around there. And he says to me, "Boy, you sure know your baseball. I have something very interesting coming up in a couple of months. David Eisenhower, my son-in-law, is a big baseball buff. I'm a big baseball buff, and I think he brought in Maury Wills or a Hall of Fame baseball player, and we're going to work up an all-star team based on who we think are the greatest players, incorporating the blacks in there. Would you like to attend that?" "I'd love it." So he said, "I'll make sure you get some kind of a notification. Give me your name and number, and I'll have my secretary, Mary Woods, send it to you." So that's how I get to meet Richard Nixon.
Okay. Let's continue with Jimmy Carter. How did you come to meet him?
Yes. San Diego was building something called a Kroc, K-R-O-C, Peace Center. The Kroc Peace Center was an institution that fostered peace all around the world. They would have people from countries come all over, which they paid for. By the way, Kroc was the owner and founder of McDonald's. He had died and left his wife with billions of dollars. Imagine what the owner of McDonald's net worth was. He left her with, back then in the 80s, $5 billion. She was a wonderful woman, Joan Kroc, and I got to know her. Her boyfriend, by the way, was Alexander Butterfield, who was the one who said that Nixon had tapes in the White House. So I met Joan Kroc at a party, and we were talking, and I told her about my experiences with Ford and Nixon. She said, "How would you like to meet Jimmy Carter?" I said, "Mr. Kroc, I'd love to." "Well, good. At the dedication of my center in 2 weeks, my main speaker is Jimmy Carter. I'll get you a ticket." Oh, I said, "That's wonderful." So I get a ticket, and fortunately, she sits me at the table with Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter is a, how would I describe Jimmy Carter? First of all, he's one of the smartest men I've ever met. The thing people faulted him on was he would manage the minutia. He's the opposite of Reagan. Reagan would give an order out to everybody, "Get this done," and then leave the room. Carter would give out that order, and he would follow you detail by detail. He would call a guy at 7 o'clock at night at home and ask him how he's doing on Project X. Ronald Reagan wouldn't know what Project X is. Now that's not a criticism, because I think this hurt Carter in the end. He micromanaged too much. But Jimmy Carter was totally different out of office, in that I followed his career in office, and he was very mean-tempered. He was quick. He gave quick responses because he just hated the combativeness between the parties. He wanted to get things done, and he hated the press digging in on what dress Amy was wearing, and he hated that extraneous nonsense. So he was kind of a bitter president. Out of office, he is a true humanitarian. I've never seen people claim he's the best ex-president. Historians say that. I would agree wholeheartedly. He has done more with his Carter Center, which I visited, than I think any other ex-president. Now, admittedly, some of them didn't have an ex-presidency. Kennedy, Roosevelt, they died either in office or a year or two later. But of the ones I'm aware of, he is without a doubt the best ex-president.
You said he was one of the most intelligent people you've ever met. How did he demonstrate that to you when you met him?
The seminar was on peace, and he would know the leaders of the Nairobi delegation who were coming, their backgrounds, the politics of that rather obscure country, and which way this party is going and that party is going. I would be shocked to find another 10 people in the United States who could explain to you the different political systems in a country like Nairobi, the advantages one has over the other, how they can get together, etc., etc. He has saved more lives by, his scientists discovered there was a certain ringworm in Africa that was killing thousands and thousands of people. And he put a special team on that, was able to eradicate that ringworm, improve the drinking water, and saved virtually over 1 million people. I've never seen somebody so well informed and so attuned to finding viable solutions once he understands the problem. I don't
think he would have been a better presidential advisor rather than president?
Yes, I don't think he was suited for the presidency. He would have been a great researcher or political advisor.
Chief of staff.
Chief of staff, but for the presidency, I do not think he was that well suited. And I think his election, and I think he kind of admitted it, was a reaction to Nixon's abhorrent behavior in the White House, and the country was ready for somebody decent, honest, a true Christian, rather than this unsavory character of Richard Nixon. And the only reason he loses, the only reason Gerald Ford told me this, he said, Al, if I hadn't pardoned Nixon, I would have probably beaten Carter. And I said, Mr. President, I think you're probably right. But there were that many people who felt after 30 days to be pardoning Nixon, even Republicans, inexcusable. But he explained why, and I happen to agree with him. So Carter was not really suited to be president. He would be an advisor to the president.
Let's continue on with Ronald Reagan. How did you meet him?
Ronald Reagan I met twice. I met a professor, Jerry Lennington, and we put together a book review newsletter called The Reviewing Stand. And he had certain contacts, and I had certain doctor clients who were quite affluent and enjoyed this kind of thing. So together we formed The Reviewing Stand, a copy of which is on our website. One day, Nancy Reagan, it's announced Nancy Reagan is writing a book called To Love a Child. Her theory was there are millions of children in this country who have parents who are separated, divorced, mean people. Why not have a foster grandparents program? There are a lot of people in their 60s who have no grandchildren. I would be an example. Who are in good health. Why not use this tremendous resource to set up a foster grandparents program? It's called To Love a Child. Lennington says, I know Nancy Reagan from the governor's days. She was first lady for 8 years. I said, gee, that's wonderful. Do you think you could get an interview with her on To Love a Child? He said, sure. I said, Jerry, that would be great. I know Jimmy Carter. I can do his memoir. Well, what a way to start out our first issue, an interview with the former First Lady, the former President. So he contacts, this is all his work, Ronald Reagan is speaking in California, and we go to this big hangar. I think it was in Long Beach, but I'm not positive, and Air Force One was on the side. Reagan was speaking, and two Secret Service men came out and said, "Gentlemen, Nancy Reagan will see you now." So we went over to Air Force One, huge, beautiful plane, and Lennington, Nancy Reagan, and myself are sitting there talking. You could tell they knew each other. We're sitting there for about 5 or 10 minutes. All of a sudden, President Reagan comes in. Now, they're virtually inseparable. I don't think he can go 2 hours without talking to her. Walks in on the plane, sits down, just plops himself down, introduces himself, big smile, and you can see how adoringly they're looking at each other. It's really obvious. And Reagan had probably heard this interview 10,000 times with the "To Love a Child." So he says to me, "I'd like a drink, so you want to come in the back with me and have something?" I said, "Mr. President, I'd love to." So we leave. I don't even think they noticed we left. They're just into it. He sits down and I sit down. Now, I had heard that Ronald Reagan loved to talk more about the movies than he did politics. And I said something to him that kind of, I don't want to use the word endeared me to him, but he knew that I was not a phony, let's say it that, and I can still repeat it. I said, "Mr. President, I just spoke the other day to your good friend Claudette Colbert." And they were very close friends. Reagan and Nancy would vacation at her home in Barbados. A lot. "Oh, really? How is she? I haven't talked to her in a couple of months. I've been kind of busy." I said, "Wonderful, wonderful." And he said, "She told me a story about you that I'd like to run by you." "Oh, I'd love to hear it." Well, as you know Claudette very well, she has a funny thing. If she goes to a party, she is very shy, she can't socialize, she can't mingle, she kind of sits in the corner waiting for people to come up to her. That's true, Alan, that's true. Yet on stage with 500 people in the theater, she was a theater star before a movie star, she says, "I'm as comfortable as I can be." Interesting. Now, she told me something about you, and I wanted to ask you. She says, the first day you were on the set at Warner Brothers, 1936, you're somewhat of a shy person, but the lighting from the set was so kind of, not blinding, but it just wipes out everything else, that you felt you were in a zone of privacy, and you all of a sudden became comfortable. Well, he had a look on his face, he says, "Boy, you really do know her." Because that's such a specific, little, isolated thing that, you'd have to know Claudette to know that story. So he goes on 10 minutes about that problem with him. "I'm not a very social guy. I don't know how to mingle that easy. But the lights from the set I felt isolated like in a little box. And when I'm alone, I'm much better." And so he immediately knew that I really must know her, because that's not something you'd pick up from a book. I don't think it's ever been published. So we are having a ball. I said, "What was it like working with Errol Flynn in the charge of the Light Brigade?" He's got 10 minutes on that. "And what was it like when you really had that dramatic role and your legs are cut off and you yell out, 'Where's the rest of me?' How did you get into that mood? Did you work from the inside out or the outside in?" Well, he is just ecstatic. He says, "This is so enjoyable. All I do all day is have meetings with Ed Meese and other people about politics. And, it's just politics, politics, politics." And I knew so much about the movies, having been schooled by Capra. And I told him that Capra had showed me 50 of his films, and he said, "Boy, am I envious of you." Then about 45 minutes into the conversation, an aide comes in, said, "Mr. President, you have to have you have to say, do me a favor, give us 10 more minutes. He was enjoying it that much. Lennington and Nancy had stopped. So I'm sitting there thinking, you've got to be enjoying it to go 10 more minutes. We might have talked about politics for 5 minutes. And the rest of it was movies. I took him from his early movies to, I said, how'd you like being a villain? You played a villain one time with Angie Dickinson and the Killers. How did you get into that? After all, you've had 75 movies as the hero. Well, he had 10 minutes on that. And he was just really having a good a time as somebody could have. And I think that led, my family was invited to see Ronald Reagan in his last days. Ronald Reagan was deteriorating pretty badly, and somebody had a list, Nancy the secretary, and I'm pleased to say I was on that list because my wife Hilda, my son Kevin, were invited to his office, probably stayed there 20 minutes. We're photographed with him, and it was very sad because he lost that ability to talk about these wonderful memories. The only thing I was advised by some friends of his is that the one story he still remembers very well is saving 77 people on Rock Beach. That he remembers. Other than that, it's all pretty fuzzy.
Let's continue with George H.W. Bush.
Yes, George H.W. Bush. Really, I have to give President Ford credit for this. He and I maintained a friendship until his death. And one day he called me up and said, have you settled in San Diego yet? I told him that I was going to be moving from Newport Beach to San Diego because of my wife's allergies. I said, Mr. President, I am. We're now in, 1998 roughly. Bush lost to Clinton, and he is doing what you call the ex-president speaking tours, where he goes all over the world and they give him $100,000 a speech. And he's going to be speaking in San Diego. And Ford said, how would you like to meet President Bush? I said, Mr. President, I'd love to. Good. He's going to be in San Diego. There's a speakers thing going on. Larry King is the moderator, and a number of Tony Robbins will be there, and Bush is one of the speakers, and I think I can arrange something. I said, great. Show up there, Al, and I will leave your name with his Secret Service team, his assistants, and something will be worked out. Okay? So I arrived there and met him that first night, and introduced myself, met the Secret Service agents, and they said to me as I'm leaving, what time do you get up in the morning? And I said, oh, 9 o'clock, 9:30. Well, tomorrow you'll be getting up at 6 a.m. Really? Why? Well, that's when you and Bush are going to have breakfast together. Boy, that's an early day. So I go. This was really nice for me because I literally had 2 hours with him alone. And I arrived at his suite, his beautiful suite there, and I think the Marriott. And sure enough, he was there at 6 a.m. And I remember several things from the conversation. First of all, he's one of the easiest guys to talk to. He puts you at ease immediately, has no airs about him, really a charming guy. And he's also very modest, because I really wanted him to take me through the way he handled the Iraq War. If you recall, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and was sucking all of the oil out of that country and throwing the different tribal people out of their homes. And Bush said this will not stand, gave Saddam a deadline, and then with a coalition of, I believe, 30 or 40 nations, defeated Saddam. So I said, Mr. President, how were you able to put together that coalition? And he said, one of the things I'm really good at is networking. He said, I believe there are 113, 130 nations in the world. I think I've met or spoken to every one of the leaders. And I have, depending on who it is, either a really friendly relationship with them or at least cordial. So when this thing came, I was able to just get on the phone and call most of them, and either they supplied troops or money. And it was really a brilliant thing. If you recall, he had Norman Schwarzkopf, the head of the army, and they went in, and within a matter of days, defeated Saddam's army, threw them out of Kuwait, and he had the intelligence of not going any further than that. And I asked him about that. I said, keep in mind his son was not elected. I think he was elected in 2000. We're now at 97, 98. Son was the governor of Texas. And I said, why did you stop? In other words, why not go into Iraq and effect regime change? He said, I'll tell you why I didn't do that. With the United States, with its massive military and tremendous financial power, had I gone in and removed Saddam, whatever damage was done to the country, whatever government agencies were sacked because I took out the president, we would have to go in and manage the country. Kind of the saying when his son, years later, made the mistake of going in, I think Colin Powell said, once you break it, you own it. And the father was smart enough not to do that. And he's very, very modest, and I said to him, it's interesting how your poll numbers went from 55, 60% approval all the way up to 90. Did you think that would hold? Because everybody thought he would be a shoo-in for re-election. And he said, politics is a strange thing. 30 days is a lifetime in politics. And he's right. You know how things change, because Bill Clinton beat him. And he was very bitter about Bill Clinton. He could not, for the life of him, understand how this draft dodger, pot smoker, that's what he called him, beat him, 2 years later after he had a 90% approval rate. I think he still didn't comprehend the fact that he lost. But he's a charming man, very, very easy to talk to, and he is remarkable in that whenever he has a meeting with me or the head of some big company, he sends you a thank you note. And I believe there's a book out now just on the thousands, maybe 5,000 thank you notes that he writes to people just thanking you for spending time with him. And I think that's a marvelous gesture. So I have a very high regard for Bush Sr., very, very down-to-earth, easy man to talk to, and only met him the one time, but it was quite a morning for me. So that pretty much ends my interviews and associations with 5 presidents of the United States.